Game shows have been my comfort food for a long time, almost as far back as I can remember. A lot of memories of sick days in school as a youngster. I remember watching game shows, watching Card Sharks and Sale of the Century and Scrabble and The Price is Right and Chain Reaction. And then in the afternoon when the Joker's Wild was on, I would watch that. It always came in handy when I needed it, when I needed to pick me up, when I wasn't feeling well. I could turn these game shows on, and between that and the comfort food my mom would make me, whether it was macaroni and cheese or noodles and butter sauce, things like that, life was good even when it was not so good. There's one game show, however, that I always will have the fondest memory of, or memories of, because it lasted a long time and it lasted into my adult life. My earliest memories of this game show, watching it religiously, were when I was living with my paternal grandmother in 1986 and into 1987. It was a rough year for me. I had family issues. I wound up living with her because I had a difficult time adapting to high school, and there was some stuff going on in the background behind the scenes. So I lived with her. She took me in, and we used to watch Wheel of Fortune at 7 o'clock and then Jeopardy at 7:30. And I always used to, when I would watch this with her, both shows, I would always shout out the answers. And my grandmother was always the first one to say, you could make us a lot of money if you went on these shows. And I kind of half believed it, but I just took it as a compliment that I was kind of sharp, I guess. But I knew that was never going to happen. So that was 86. And then things kind of pieced themselves back together. And I wound up living with her again in 1990, from the summer of 1990 through the spring of 1991 when I went to college. Rather than stay in a dorm, I stayed at her house while I was going to college. And college didn't work out, but we still watched Wheel of Fortune at 7 and Jeopardy at 7:30, and we did the same thing. I would shout the same answers. She would tell me all the time that I needed to go on that show, that I was so smart. And these were they were niceties. They were things to make me feel good about myself, and it was something that my grandmother excelled at doing. And then in 1990, for Christmas, my grandmother bought me my Nintendo Entertainment System, which I have talked about on camera before. And one of the gifts that she got me to kind of celebrate our time watching game shows together was she got me Jeopardy 25th Anniversary Edition alongside Super C and Super Mario 3 and the system itself. And if I'm being completely honest, this was the game that I played first. Not Super Mario 3 and not Super Contra and not Super Mario Duck Hunt. This was it, because it reminded me of our time hanging out together. And why this resonates with me right now, of course, is because of the sad passing of Alex Trebek on November 8th, 2020. He was 80 years old. Alex was a consummate pro. He was the man who kept the show in control. He always exuded intelligence and manners and class, and he was just cool in a nerd kind of way. I felt when I was watching him, like if I happened to be on the show, like it would be just as cool to meet him as it would be to actually participate in the show and hopefully try and win some money. So I played this a lot. I still play it on occasion, and it reminds me of my grandmother. And my love for the show is really just beginning at this point, because now that I had my NES, I could play more Jeopardy games. Like the original Jeopardy, for example, which is pretty much the same thing, developed by Rare Coin It, and I would play this a lot. And this was even harder because the questions were older, so there was more trivia knowledge that I needed to know. And then I had the Super Nintendo versions, I had the Sega Genesis versions, which I don't have here in front of me. But the legacy would just continue. And through the 16-bit era, when we were actually able to see Alex on the screen in digitized form, and we would hear snippets of his voice, it added such an air of authenticity to the game show. Even though you weren't making real money, it felt like you were on the set, that he was talking to you, that he was looking at you, that you were interacting with him. And it was amazing for the time. I think it's really difficult to really convey how cool it was if you were a fan of the show to actually have him talking and seeing him on the screen. It was much different than the NES versions of these here, where you just had the basic set and you didn't have him. It was just a generic game show host, and that was fine because it replicated the Jeopardy experience. But Alex Trebek was part of the Jeopardy experience, which is why it was so important to have him in the games. And then when we got to the PlayStation and Nintendo 64 era, we actually got that. We have Alex's face right here on the front. You could hear his voice during the game as he would make comments. It was just awesome. And we even got a second edition of the same game. In the second edition, you actually had a contestant exam. So finally, after my grandmother had unfortunately passed, I was actually able to take a contestant exam and find out whether I would have made it on the show or not. By the way, I wouldn't have, which kind of sucks, but it is what it is. But having these just made it even more authentic. And the Nintendo 64 version of the game certainly tried too. You could see and hear Alex. And it only got better from there. I mean, the PlayStation 2 version of the game was so good and so tight. And then the Wii version of the game actually had a Alex Trebek me, which was really the cap on the cake. Seeing a very a super deformed version of Alex Trebek kind of working his way onto the stage. Alex was Jeopardy. Without him, although the show will still continue, and I'm sure whoever the host winds up being that takes over will keep the tradition going, but Alex was that show. He was the ringleader. He was the one that kept it going. He was the one that provided the wit. He was the one that no matter what the question was, what the difficult pronunciation was, he was always able to nail it, and so professionally. Just so many memories. And it's hard, even though we knew with Alex's pancreatic cancer that the end was going to be coming. He had even mentioned or alluded to that fact earlier this year. So we knew that this day was going to be at hand, but it was still difficult today to process the fact that he was no longer here. And in a year where it seemed like every single challenge that there could be has popped up all simultaneously, between the health scare and between a deeply divided political scenario and between economic strife and between a lot of people that we knew losing their lives or just passing in general. There's just been so much uncertainty and so much negativity and so much awful stuff this year. And it just seems that Alex's death now just adds another cherry on top of a sundae that feels like it's taller than the Empire State Building. But through all that, I always have the memories of my grandmother and myself sitting in the living room, each in a separate chair, at 7:30 every weeknight. And Jeopardy would come on the air, and Alex would read the answers. Then I would shout out the questions, right or wrong. And I can still hear my grandmother telling me, "Peter John, you really need to be on that show." Thanks, Alex, for the memories, for everything. And my love of game shows will continue. And when I think about the great pantheon of game show hosts, I do believe that Alex is going to be sitting at the head of that table. Thanks for watching this episode of RePete. And until the next time, my friends, take care of yourselves and each other.